to Mindcrime, Liberty Show with me, Swithin Dobson, and him, Tim Patton. Today we discuss, can we escape liberalism? Tim.
A key problem over this whole episode, before we get started here, is definition, terms, and the usage of meaning word. It's a common problem here. So, what is our exact society here? I'd say liberalism is a good enough word to use it in a Wittgensteinian form of definition theory. You'd also call it crony capitalism. You'd also call it social democracy. You'd also call it neoliberalism. Neoliberalism probably might be the most technical term, although it's not entirely clear. If Hayek is the representative, Milton Friedman are representatives of neoliberalism, do we live in that era? I don't know. I mean, I do think in some ways we have capitalist institutions. I do think we have democratic institutions here. So my answer to the question is can this be escaped here? Is no. Outside of anarchism, or a kind of parody or farce version of anti-liberalism, whether to the left or whether to the right. Liberalism may be escaped by going full anarchist again, as Keith Preston defends in his great long essay. But the version of classical liberalism defended by someone like Sean Gabb at the PFS and other and Mises Institute, he's given this defense elsewhere, I think is basically unassailable here. If there is a state, the only legitimate states out there are ones which have a liberal character. When people criticize like the U.S. government or the Russian government, the historical Russian, like the Tsar, the USSR, they're gonna criticize on liberal grounds. When U.S. goes after Julian Assange or bombs a place, you say this is a illiberal thing to do. And the defenders of it, like the neocons and neoliberals who defend American bombing, like Christopher Hitchens or people who defend it, would say, well, there's some greater good, and that greater good tends to be liberal. And this USSR will do the same thing, and you'll get people like Doug Lane who more or less say that, long term, the U.S. was probably more liberal than the Soviet Union. Although the tankies would disagree with some of the more liberal Marxists on this grounds here. But they'll defend it almost all on liberal ground. They say, no, actually the U.S., I see people on the right complain about U.S. imprisoning Julian Assange. They're not saying, no, we actually should go after all journalists. No, they're not saying that. That would be like the anti-liberal thing to do here. And that's one of the things that Keith Preston brought up in a great roundtable with Sean Gabb, Todd Lewis, and there was a few other people, but those were the key players here. The definition of that Gabb gave was that, no punishment of religious heretics, not with death, at least, or burning. Some version of no, you can teach anyone without having a license from the state or the ruling class, and no judicial torture. That was those three things that liberalism includes. And very few people are for them. And actually, the show trials of the Soviet Union, again, that's another point where, this is where Chomsky would call it a right-wing problem. So again, definitions are going to hang over this. But I do think we should have a discussion about what exactly is our current society, and can that thing be escaped here? Because one of the things I think the people on the ends miss, and I'm just using these terms technically, not morally, like most people, the far left and the far right, both think they're always losing. Now, I would say at the end of the day, this is a good thing. Certain things is a good thing. The reason I say this is the far left will never get what it's want, and the far right will never get what it's wants. I was listening to the free man behind the wall, Peter Quines. I'm not sure how to say his last name, but you also get other reactions like McIntyre, Moldbug, the Mises crowd, and other groups. One of the things that they tend to miss is the far left is not particularly happy about the current state of affairs here. Again, this goes back to term problems here. But when they don't think they're winning. Whether they are winning or not is a good question. They actually think the right's winning, but the right doesn't think it's winning here. So I will bring it to just show how pessimistic it is. I've included three thinkers here who I think all think liberalism can't be escaped, and all of them more or less. Well, Nick Land is the one that won't. But I included Mark Fisher, Nick Land, and Alexander Macintyre. So I'm going to bring up Mark Fisher. Mark Fisher is interesting because he's taught at university here, and he's a big influence on Zizek, Michael Brooks, Ben Burgess, others. Mark Fisher is a great anti-capitalist and wrote a book called Capitalist Realism. My reading, it's free. It's available on Zero Books. It's free to anyone. Zizek's heavily quoted in it, and Zizek quotes it a lot. Zizek likes to answer the question, what would you do on day 2 after the revolution? He says there's no answer, and Mark Fisher agrees here. By the way, Mark Fisher committed suicide. So if you think I'm misreading the book. If one's life is a kind of testament, I think the outcome is at least pertinent information. So again, what one has a society which is liberal, democratic, and capitalist. As people like David Graeber point out, is in order to have democracy, you're going to have to get rid of the capitalism part. So and then what Fischer does is like a via negativity strategy. And some of Zizek's best analysis is here. Capitalist realism takes the form of kind of super identification with capital. In fact, capitalist realism is very far from precluding a certain anti-capitalism. After all, and as Zizek has provocatively pointed out, anti-capitalism is widely disseminated in capitalism. Time after time, the villain in Hollywood films will turn out to be the evil corporation. Time after time, the capitalist realism, this gestural anti-capitalism, actually reinforces it. Take the film WALL-E. This film shows an Earth so despoiled that human beings are no longer capable of inhabiting it. We are left in no doubt that the consumer capitalism and corporations, or rather one mega corporation, by and large, is responsible for this depredation. And when we see eventually the human beings in off-world exile, they're infantile and obese, interacting via screen interfaces, carried around in large motorized chairs, and supplying and supping indeterminate slups from cups. I'll stop there here. Again, I saw that movie as a kid. I was horrified by that movie. I was like one of the right wing. Well, I don't know if you'd call me right wing at that point, but you could also call that movie a fat phobia film too, if you really want to get technical there. But there's something cartoonishly interesting about that. Like a capitalism is so good it can make money. Now I know the Ron DeSantis and other people will say Disney's a woke corporation. Is it or is it not? That's a good question here. But from their point of view, it's not winning. And again, what's interesting about Fischer, he also makes fun of the universities here. I'm going to read what he says about universities here. Teachers are now put under intolerable pressure to mediate between the post-alert subjectivity of the late capitalist consumer and the demands of the disciplinary regime to pass examination. This is one way in which education, far being from some ivory tower, safe from the real world, is the engine room of the reproduction of social reality, directly confronted the inconsistencies of the capitalist social field. Teachers are caught between being facilitator entertainers and disciplined authoritarians. Teachers want to help students pass exams. They want us to be authority figures who tell them what to do. When families buckling, I'm paraphrasing here, when families buckling under the pressures of capitalism, which requires both parents to work, teachers now increasingly required to act as surrogate parents, instilling the most basic behavioral protocols in students, and providing pastoral and emotional support for teenagers who are in some cases only minimally socialized. That's not a very good defense of universities. So again, you get the far right who says universities are run by leftists, and then you get Mark Fisher, who's an influence on Zizek. He might be like the mold bug of the left. He himself, who's taught in university, does not think of these places like some wonderful place here. They think they're losing here. Now the other two thinkers I'll bring up, which I think is basically the sort of prophets of doom here. Doom for the anti-liberals is Macintyre, who we discussed before. Macintyre has this great quote in After Virtue. I've never gotten over it in the sense that he says that once the Marxists become pessimists, Marxist socialism is at its core deeply optimistic, forever thoroughgoing critique of capitalists and bourgeois institutions may be, is committed to asserting that within the society constituted by those institutions, all the human and material preconditions of a better future are being accumulated. We discussed this in a longer episode. We did Macintyre versus Marx, and that's more attacking the left ones, but you can also equally attack the right ones on this ground. You run into these sort of more far right people. So this is why I think liberalism won't be defeated by the right here, partly because they are liberals, and especially here in like Protestant Anglo societies, we sort of reflexively liberal, as Sean Gabb argues here in that episode here. Now again, you always get bogged down in terms here, but a lot of ideas, and actually Moldbug himself in the Ultra Calvinism brings this up here, and he doesn't really provide a way out of it. Things like feminism, things like universal suffrage, those come from Christianity somewhat, for better or for worse. There's always countervailing tensions within them. Interestingly enough, a lot of it comes down to the meaning and usage of words Paul used. So the word definition problem goes all the way down. But my theory is it's inescapable here. Well, it's inescapable, definitely in the near and the medium term, if not the long term here. I think we're still living in some sort of liberal era insofar as the left won't get what it wants, neither will the right get what it's want. So that's my sort of opening treatise here against it, against the revolutionaries. What do you make of my treatise here against this? Can it be escaped? Do we want to escape it? Is my treatise within right here is Mark Fischer's pessimism, like, what do you make of that, Swithin?
I think we have to distinguish various aspects of the existing regime, whatever we want to call it. I think a broad distinction one could make is between the economic and the cultural. And it seems very much to me that, at least with the present regime, it's the economic angle which cannot be directly touched. You have the sort of economy is run by banks post 1971 with pure fiat money. That's that's kind of the current sort of economic paradigm that exists, and that cannot be really undone. And anything that's sort of tied in with that isn't really anything that's going to change, and that's a critique. And so economically, what the left and the far left or the far right want aren't going to get it, because that would upset far too many interests at present to be able to get away from basically what you could refer to as welfare state capitalism, or welfare state capitalism, or any sort of very much. It's very much sort of like the mixed technocratic economic paradigm. So the quotes you made about teachers having to be entertainers and disciplinarians is entirely true. That's the function of the education system predominantly. That we have to have all these standardized people being churned out, and then the teachers need to sort of fulfill multiple odd entertainment, because the kids don't want to be there, so you've got to try and keep them there somehow by entertaining them, but then also they've got to pass exams at the same time. So it's an entirely accurate thing. And so same thing with the Mark Fisher at universities, again the same thing. Why do most people go to the universities? Well, because they want to get credentialized. Why do you need to get credentialized so they can get a job? That's not necessarily a bad thing, but the whole system is there to help perpetuate the current economic paradigm. As you were mentioning, say, before we came on, that Zizek mentions that a lot of the cultural left stuff, which the right would say that they are losing on, which is pretty clear that they are. I can't see how the right is really winning any cultural battles, unless, of course, you include the potential revocation of Roe v. Wade. But even then, that's not really a right-wing victory. A right-wing victory would be the opposite, being imposed by the Supreme Court, which just means that each state can do what they want with respect to abortion law. But as Zizek said, I mean, a lot of the woke stuff, the tranny stuff and things, doesn't really impact the economics paradigm that much. The only thing actually that, the most the biggest cultural change that could alter the current economic paradigm would, of course, be from the right, really, which is, women aren't really part of the wage slave class anymore, because that would mean that a corporation would have significantly fewer workers to choose from, which, of course, wouldn't be good for business. So I think on the current, so based on that, though, I think there's a reasonable amount of cultural change that could happen that would be possibly changed, although that would be largely determined by the media organs, because basically whatever the media, if there's enough media groups saying the same thing for long enough, people start believing it and thinking it's correct. So I think that's more plastic. I think changing the economic paradigm would take much more effort, because it'll be a much more bigger structural change. But that's likely only to take place after a huge additional crash. which of course could well be on its way. But no one is going to actively try to change an economic regime when a significant number of people are doing well in it. Only when enough people get sufficiently dissatisfied with it can it then be altered. But on the cultural stuff and the liberal aspects of the things that Sean Gabb said, you could argue on there, I mean, that the current regime is becoming more illiberal. Yes, it's true, you can say most things don't get arrested, put in jail, but again, on the fringes, you can. If you say unpleasant, uncharitable things about the Jews and the Holocaust, that can get you in jail in Britain. And now with digital communication acts in Britain, if you send tweets and stuff, you can get arrested for them. So it does seem certainly the case that typical liberal, what we traditionally consider liberal values, are going down the wayside. And also Julian Assange, you mentioned before, is interesting to compare with Daniel Ellsberg. Daniel Ellsberg is defended by all the media class, and then he's a hero. Julian Assange is the Home Secretary away from being extradited to the US. So on the sort of more traditional sort of liberal.
I'll be quick interrupt with a joke. Julian Assange is a Kremlin agent who wants to elect Trump. That's really what he is. LOL.
Well, yes, obviously. Well, I mean, you could. I suppose you could say that we don't like Julian Assange because Julian Assange isn't really part of the corporate media class, and he's basically an enemy. He's basically an economic enemy because WikiLeaks is giving people unredacted. Well, no, actually, he did redact it, but first-hand information they could read up and didn't have to go through the media organs, and so therefore is a competitor. So I suppose, though, as a general opening, when it comes to whether we can escape liberalism, it depends what it mean by liberalism. Obviously, we should be sort of agreed-ish on there, I think. But also, I think what is the major driver of societal change and what do people value the most? You could interpret the things I've said so far that people care about economics more than anything else, which isn't necessarily true. So I suppose that would be an important matter. Although what I would say is it seems to me now that people are much more happy to criticize lockdowns now that their wallets are being affected. Whereas 2 years ago, oh, no, can't kill Granny. Got to keep Granny alive for the cost of £30 million. It's fine. It's all good because it wasn't their money. But now it's going up in price and stuff. Well, lockdowns aren't so good. So yeah, those would be my general initial thoughts on the topic.
Interesting. I will say this though: so what drives the far left and far right to be so sad and pessimistic is the interesting question here. And to me, in a sense, this episode is moderate. Not to sound like the sort of annoying make this about myself here, but the sense this is sort of self-therapy here insofar as I don't like. Should we be upset that liberalism can't be escaped here? That's sort of like the TLDR version of things. Are things as bad as they say they are? Because both of we use the technical terms, think we're sort of heading towards some sort of apocalypse. The far right thinks we're heading towards sort of a demographic and some other apocalypse. And then people like Wolfers and Burgess and Fischer thinks that, we're going to be all underwater. Now you could argue whether on empirical technical grounds, whether these apocalypses are going to come true, whether things are as bad as they say they are, or you go full Matt Ridley here and just say things are better than they ever were. But are things as bad as things? Like, to be fair about the lockdowns here, and this is where I'll bring up Nick Land and some of the other people here. Nick Land is an interesting reactionary here. He wrote he's part of the Dark Enlightenment type group, and he moved to China here. He said China's come from the future here. And to bring up Peter, China is often cited as an anti-liberal power. It's cited by the Tankies that. It's cited by Richard Wolff. Wolfer still defends the whoever means the social democrat Marxist guy who's been on Jimmy Dore and he's been on a Ben Burgess show. That guy, and he's debated Gene Epstein. That guy I'm talking about. he also praises the Chinese lockdown policy. To be fair, places like Britain and the United States exited the lockdowns. So in that regard, the conspiracy is over here. And, we did get documents about the Iraq War. We are getting, whether Fauci will get, hung up by, the Senate or whatever is a good question here. But to be fair, the lockdown masks are gone from the airlines here. But China still does its lockdown. So if you supported it, then you should go ahead and that's actually the policy going forward here. And I've been going through some of the work of Peter Zien here, and Peter Zien is rather skeptical. He's a very big China skeptic. So if China is a society from the future, as Nick Land argues here that it is, in his book, sort of the society of accelerationism, that and Alex Jones, by the way, agrees with this thing, like all this sort of research, including like the COVID research, which is how we probably got this virus out here. And this is where Alex Jones talks about the animal-human hybrid stuff. That all occurs in China because it's sort of like a sort of hyper, like state capitalist society. Like here in Western Europe and the United States, we have environmental and ethical regulations. And you could argue they're sort of phony. We argue in certain regards we should get rid of them because certain things aren't as bad as that thing. And I on those questions, I'm very uncertain and unclear here. But like the really bad, like that kind of research happens over there for a reason here. But the lockdowns still continue. They're over. Again, you could, this is where Peter Quine was like, people like Moldbug early on praised the lockdown response as being like, oh, technocratic or whatever. And I've always, I find that as interesting. And we went back to the wars and things like that. We at least get the documents that Julian Assange gets. So to me, this is liberalism for the win. In a sense, it's liberalism for the win here. So the escapist route here, the far right does not get to win the cultural battles, but it also does not lose. It also, sorry for being a little disjointed jumping around here, but it also doesn't lose the economic things. And economics remains like, when Mark Fischer was talking about in his essay how they have to be parents, like how they have to be like surrogate parents here. He sounds like Roger Scruton or a cultural conservative. That's a very interesting. That's like a very interesting line that he doesn't want to be a parent. He wants the parents to be parents. Well, maybe a reason why that is women in the workforce, Mark Fisher, and that child raising has been offloaded to the state, and the state's a poor parent here. And actually, if you look at successful people, or more productive people, they tend to have sort of more traditional-ish insofar as women being at home, or at least grandmothers or other people watching them when they're growing up, rather than state daycare and things like that. So there is interesting interludes in their analysis here that that go there. So what do you make about the pessimism point? Like, you do agree that the two fringes, and I'm just using these terms technically, not necessarily morally, aren't very, like, so to speak, optimistic about our society here. And Ed Fedder had an interesting piece in American Conservative have these are oikophobia here. We've sort of discussed this not directly, but there's a certain degree in which certain extremes so much dislike their society they might hate it. And this is what I think is the Macintyre point in his book After Virtue here, is that like if you hate your society enough, then in a sense you should want it to fail, or at least not continue on, or not root for it. And I'll be fair to people like Nick Land who move away, think that the United States and Britain are just sort of stuck in like the 1950s or 1970s and can't get out of it. But it seems like those areas are just going to collapse anyways. So maybe the liberal capitalist democracies aren't as bad as the fringes say they are. Although I do agree with their great critiques in a sense. But what do you make of the pessimism points with him?
Well, what I would say is in general, the far left and the far right, you could argue, depending how you want to use the term far right, do tend to hold relatively similar, although not identical, reasonably similar economic views. I mean, if you look at the self-described fascists, you have a state-directed economy. Now, it may have a different veneer. It might be elite-led. It might be, self-consciously authoritarian and Catholic or something. Whereas the far left would be, oh no, this is a worker-run operation, but it's still centralized to sort of Marxist-Leninism. Instead, a case of Caleb Bobin. I mean, practically speaking, you could say that they're pretty darn similar. And also, a lot of the far left tanky types are actually relatively socially conservative in the same way that the far right are. So in a sense, you could say that despite their very different modes of analysis, they're actually quite similar, which would explain the pessimism in both cases. I'd say going on any group which thinks that the economic situation of the society is fundamentally wrong is definitely pessimistic, because nothing has really changed. I mean, the biggest change that took place was recently was 1945 to 1971, and then 71 afterwards. You have sort of more obviously sort of like Keynesian, more nationalized firms and stuff, and involvement of unions as well. And then you get the complete financialization of the economy post 1970, and particularly when you get to Reagan and Thatcher. That's the major economic changes. I described it in the past. It was basically the post-war period was sort of like communist Russia, and then early on, and then 1979 onwards has basically been the new economic policy. So you've effectively had the same economic policy since, well, at least 40 years, and you could even say back to 45. And even then, actually, you could say the economic policy really hasn't changed that much, even beforehand. I remember reading something from the Communist Party, who were interested. They were pro-Brexit with the Communist Party, and they were complaining how the Labour Party sold out to international finance capitalism back in like the 30s. The Communist Party clearly thought that things have been wrong for a while. So I think economically, anybody who thinks either we should have the public ownership of the means of production or Ancapistan are going to be pessimistic, because, as I say, we've got variants on welfare state capitalism. On the cultural angle, I mean, I just can't see how anybody of the social left thinks that even if things are bad, and I could kind of see why you might think they're bad. I mean, so for instance, Family Guy, we haven't watched for ages. You could argue in certain respects is quite conservative in a way, which is, you might think is kind of odd. But the way in which, they always get back together at the end, etc., and this family, it's a bit dysfunctional, but it's kind of the best they've got. You could say is some sort of somewhat conservative, underlying sort of conservatism in certain senses. So I could see that, but I can't see how the social left don't think that things are getting better. Although that said, they do seem to think that in the terms of some of the feminists, and go, oh no, girls and women are more oppressed than they were in the 1950s, except they don't actually give a date, but they kind of give that impression. Oh no, misogyny is everywhere. So there is certain respects that they would complain. But obviously the right clearly, I think, is more justified when it comes to cultural things. On one just thing at the moment, I remember on Disney. Disney was considered early on to be quite a revolutionary organization, not very conservative in a sense. Well, I say that insofar as Salvador Dali, when he came to America, said he wanted to work with the three great surrealists of our time. One was Cecil B. DeMille, who directed The Ten Commandments. I can't remember who the other one was, and the other guy was Walt Disney. Now, I haven't known surrealism to be considered somewhat conservative, so it might just be the fact that the conservatives aren't really thoroughgoingly conservative enough to realize that Disney may have been somewhat revolutionary from the beginning. Make of that what you will.
I'm not totally dox myself. I'm going to betray some of my bourgeois probably upper middle class background here. But as far as Disney is concerned, I'm gonna bring up Disney World. As a kid and even as a younger adult, we used to go there. I haven't been there since COVID, but and it's gotten more expensive. But Disney, this is where I think the far right sort of attack on corporate capitalism gets a bit dodgy and oikophobic at times. Disney is where it is, I think. Now it did get. I sort of did. We haven't. We did release the episode we did on wealth inequality. Disney is where it is, partly because of IP, partly because of other factors. But Disney was revolutionary. Disney himself, Disney families, the first generation of the dynasty, and the theme parks as well. They're great theme parks. You can sort of say, you can take sort of this sort of a position of anything, sort of like a parody position, like anything of fun is bad here. Which, but like if you want to go, I don't think there's anything wrong with a ride like Test Track or Space Mountain. It's like a roller coaster inside of a movie theater. That's what you think of a lot of these rides that they've built. I mean, they're innovative. They're well maintained. And Bob Murphy will defend Disney World as what Encapistan at times would look like here. So I do think to defend, again, now you could say I'm just a bootlicker for Disney here. I don't think I'm necessarily, I think Disney should lose its copyright for Mickey Mouse. I think it should lose all its, it shouldn't get any tax rights from Florida as well. I agree. But then again, this is sort of like, what is to be done here and so forth. And then it's worth pointing out that Mark Fisher, so when the right sees Disney or other corporations making when you have when you have Netflix making documentaries about slums, and they're just and Netflix is in itself like a sort of capitalist organization that or Amazon is posting BLM while not allowing its labor unions. The far left does not view those as wins. They view them as cultural tokens. The people, the Fishers and the Burgesses and others, and the Tankies as well. So I do want to push back. I do think that Disney and those other they're on top for a reason here. They're if you go to China before the lockdowns, I had some experience there, and a lot of the girls, if they have English names, they'll call them Elsa, and the reason they'll call them Elsa is because of the Disney movie Frozen. So there's Harry Potter is very popular there too. So I think a lot of Western culture here is gone everywhere. You can hate that, you can like that. I'm not sure if that's a win or a loss for the far teens, but it's definitely a win for the center here. It's definitely a win for the sort of Randy and minarchist types, the Christopher Hitchens types, as well as not the straight out the cultural leftists here. It's definitely a win for them. The people that write for Washington Post and that class of persons there. So I do think they are. I think it's interesting you brought it up there, but I do think they are a transformative company in that respect. They sort of made Florida a vacation destination. You can also say the air conditioner made Florida. But that's somewhat of a long aside here. I want to go back. If you want to comment on that, I want to go back to the term. I want to go back to the term liberalism here. And Swithin, you've been. I wouldn't say a stickler, but you could say that. And I say this with a big smile. It seems like terms could just be the whole issue here. We've done an episode with Rick Story, or does grammar exist here? And term debates have long been a problem throughout, I'd say throughout English history, to say the least. Especially in recent history, the whole feminism debate in Christianity seems to hinge on the meaning context of Paul's use of the word authority and what does the church mean. Word disputes are everywhere, and the free speech debate. Well, we believe in free speech, we believe in consequences, or something like that. You get that kind. So with a word like liberal, I do does it have any use? I might ask Swithin. Before we continue there, that'll be my question. Does a word like liberal or neoliberal have a use? Is it merely pejorative? There's a lot of synonyms like late capitalism. Macintyre uses the term late capitalism because Macintyre is a closeted Marxist, which is fine. Say some was the Scruton, I think, uses that term as well. Like, what about words here? And if you have any comments about Disney and the corporations, what do you make of that, Swithin?
Well, I do think they do have some use, but it's got to be careful how you use them. I suppose of any of them, I think neoliberal is kind of like the least useful because, well, I suppose I say that just because the people who use the term are ones who somehow think we're in sort of, well, actually just like 1 degree away from Ancapistan, and somehow, we got this wildcat capitalism. It's like, what? Like that bears no resemblance to reality in any way, shape, or form. Liberalism in general, I think, has. I mean, the problem with liberalism, in a sense, you've kind of got like the classical and sort of like modern liberalism. I mean, I tried to come up with what I thought were the underlying aspects of liberalism, which I will say here. The idea of in liberalism that the family and social like groupings don't really exist. It's kind of like there's methodological individualism and basically ontological individualism. Only individuals exist. Individuals have rights, and only individuals have rights. Social life is basically contractarian in nature, explicitly or implicitly. Fourthly, natural law doesn't exist. If you're a liberal, you either hold divine command theory or you're an amoralist. Those formal and final causation doesn't exist. Only material and efficient causation exist. Fifthly, the liberal believes that the whole world should be liberal. It's universalist in that sense, which essentially say Christianity is as well in some respects. And lastly, this isn't always true, but I think largely true, because the liberal thinks the whole world should be liberal. It will support centralization if it thinks it will, at least at this time or for the foreseeable future, have liberal effects. And I think that captures various different modes of liberalism. So I do think liberalism has, it is a very slippery term, as many terms are. But I do think liberalism is somewhat meaningful, although in most uses of the term, it tends not to be. Back to Disney briefly. I think it's interesting with liberalism in general, and we haven't really got to sort of like the individual self-expression and sort of family issues when it comes to liberalism. Is that to what extent does technology make society liberal? Does the fact that people can move around mean that people now end up being more individual in the way they act? Historically, they'd have to operate within a thick sort of social culture, and there wasn't really much way out of it, since they were just existed in it. Whereas now you have to consciously choose to do things, and now you can consciously do things and go, well, I get paid more if I move a few hundred miles away, so I will. And so that sort of unleashes, well, effectively you could argue that at least modern technologies are giving each individual person more power insofar as they are able to, well, obviously not all of them in a sense, because they may not earn as much comparatively, so you have to be nuanced that, but certainly they are much more mobile. Which I think is crucial for liberalism. And then related to that with entertainment, I mean, you don't need to leave the house for entertainment anymore, which you could say is inherently sort of liberalizing, because it's about your individual tastes and preferences rather than enough people who can fill out a theatre or enough people who can actually play reasonably well for a concert, because you just listen to whatever you want to. And that actually goes back to Disney. What I would say is, in a technical sense, I do think Disney have produced good art. They have some, it's not brilliant, but it's decent. I mean, you can see why it's popular. I mean, a lot of the woke stuff they're putting in now, in a sense, well, it can actually be done artfully, but they seem to be going to propagandizing mode. I mean, you can have a well-constructed film. So for instance, a film I like, it's an Argentinian film actually, Secrets in Their Eyes. You could argue basically it's a pro-adultery film, but it doesn't bash you over the head with it, and actually fits artfully with the entirety of the film. And so you can do that, and it still kind of be technically good. And I think that's why a lot of it is popular. And also, a lot of these other countries don't have the resources to make the things that Hollywood makes. So like in China, for instance, the Chinese love stupid action films, which is why America produces a lot of them these days, because the Chinese market's massive. And so feels like McDonald's and a lot of the American culture. I mean, I wouldn't say they're great to a large extent, but they certainly fulfill a need, and they are, technically proficient. Now, obviously, this is predicated on being able to distinguish kind of like technique and technical proficiency and artistic merit separate in certain respects from ideology and theme. But I think on like a technical level, the American organizations, relative to any ones that currently exist now, of course, you could say other ones would exist in other scenarios, which I would probably agree, but they kind of tend to do pretty well. And of course, the fact that most people around the world, English, be careful. I don't know if English is the most spoken second language in the world, but it's probably close with geographical spread and things. So I wouldn't say that the American organizations are bad and incompetent. They're kind of, to a large extent, bad but competent enough compared to the rest of the competition. I think that would be a fair assessment of Disney and other sort of corporate entities.
I'll bring up the movie WALL-E here again, because WALL-E, on the one level, Mark Fisher is correct that Disney making money off WALL-E by selling a dystopia, like, or other movies like The Hunger Games. There's other these ostensibly, well, you can try to read different messages in them, but are ostensibly culturally woke messages. Elite. There's some other Elysium. There's other big box Hollywood films that are essentially left wing. Okay. But but the structure of the organization making them is right wing. Now I know there's a quote that they'll sell I think Atlanta has that they'll sell the rope we hang the capitalists with on it. So maybe there is that aspect of play. But for all the quote unquote woke culture stuff, at the end of the day, there were corporate capitalists, and the people like the Fischerites don't think, that's a new term, don't think and the Graeberians don't think that capitalism could exist without the state or in its current form. With the Rothbardians at times partly agree with them here. This is go back into the term dissection here. So what we're left with is, does Disney and McDonald's and those things, is that the colloquial definition of capitalism here? I would say, yeah, in a sense, it is the colloquial definition of capitalism or liberalism. Now I don't see. Interestingly enough, I don't think it's as bad. Disney and these corporations are very good at hitting the median consumer, in my opinion. I think that's their great strength. That's their sort of strength that like they're popular almost. They can be popular almost everywhere here. And again, you get this odd problem that shows up where places like Cuba and North Korea, speaking of societies that have escaped the sort of liberal tentacles here, like North Korea, they don't listen to K-pop or things like that. So in a sense, North Korea has escaped liberalism, but I would argue that's a kind of parody form of a left-wing government. I'm not saying it's not a genuine government. I'm not saying that people shouldn't be free to do that experiment here. But to go back to Gab's definition here, I really, if given the opportunity to leave, how many North Koreans would stay there? Now this goes into sort of Platonic ideas about consent and like the cave and so to speak, which liberalism as one for definition was about a kind of methodological individualism here. The sort of more communitarian would say, well, you need sort of like identity that's lodged within the group to even make a decision, like a family or like a nation state, that the liberals sort of dissolve here. Todd Lewis also made that point with respect to Sean Gabb here. So Sean Gabb would just say plenty of orders deserve to be hollowed out. And if Disney is this thing that's doing the hollowing out, then so be it. Voss, interestingly, he's like a YouTuber, probably sponsored by the U.S. government indirectly. Um, um, he says that like the U.S. bases are actually just the vestigial element. We should just send weapons abroad and send consumer culture abroad. We should just actually get rid of the aircraft carriers. He said this on a debate with Destiny or somebody else. I thought that was an interesting sort of like, very honest, very clear. Like if you really want to spread American culture, Iraq and Afghanistan is actually the worst way to do it. The better way to do it is just to have like broadcast Disney movies around the world, or broadcast, rock and roll things like that, like the Beatles or things like that. Well, by the way, Roger Scruton likes the Beatles, from my understanding. So that's my point there. I think the culture which is often associated with capitalism, the McDonald's, the Disney, and so forth. The Rothbardians are technically correct that it's not pure capitalists, but the left calls it that. But what can be done here? The same thing applies to democracy here. And this is again a point which I think shows up with you and Keith got made fun of Walter Block somewhat for calling Joe Biden a socialist here. I was like, well, I know what Biden means, and I actually think that in a sense it's true. In the sense that Joe Biden is a socialist, but there's another sense where Joe Biden is not a socialist at all. Just ask, is Ben Burgess or Jimmy Dore or the late Mark Fisher, would they be happy with Joe Biden? No, of course not. They view him as a sellout to capital. Now, again, is that pure capital? So democracy doesn't technically work. We don't really have democracy. We had this Moldbug versus Chomsky hypothetical debate here. And one of the points why I would make is that democracy doesn't really exist in the Western world. But this goes back, in a sense, it exists in the Western world. In a sense, leaders do justify. We have public opinion polls. I don't know if North Korea does. But North Korea is the kind of parody. Those kind of projects could happen. Those kind of projects could happen. But if enough people, would they want to be there? That's a kind of like very liberal question here. Sometimes, like maybe 40 years ago, people sometimes would ask that question about the Amish. Interestingly enough, the Amish, the outside opinions on the Amish is fairly high. Amish, Mennonites, Hutterites. But maybe 40 years ago, you could find people saying you could find documentaries of people who sort of escaped the Amish in the same way people escape North Korea. Or people escape Scientology or things like that. So some of the sort of religious groups the right will point to as sort of exemplars of what they want society to be. It's very unclear here. But I do think certain aspects of liberalism are fairly well entrenched here. And speaking of Disney, it targets the sort of medium consumer. I think liberalism remains targeting the median consumer. Now, I do agree with people like Taleb that the tyranny of like a certain minority does in a way drive culture. But it's still the medium thing consists Disney. And to be fair, many of the left-wing people are basically bourgeois married. That's Charles Murray's point. That Ben Burgess married, Mark Fisher, like the people who are happy and productive tend to be, married to parents with some kids or childless and just works jobs they like. Now Mark Fisher is honest and thinks that universities are just, factories in that way, which is true. But that's my point here. I'm starting to wrap it up here, Swithin. What do you make of my final comments? We're about 45 minutes in here. What do you make of those comments, Swithin?
Well, I think you're broadly correct. I think we are having a situation where you're sort of playing to the median consumer. Although, as I indicated before, I think the intent was to change the median consumer. In a sense, I mean, Gail Mopin will go with this, and Kerry Bolton does as well. The influence on culture by the funding of, say, the CIA, Gloria Steinem. And then also the ultra-capitalist class in the non-profit foundations, such as the Ford Foundation, etc., funding radical student groups, etc. It is certainly the case that well, I suppose you could say this is a very bland take. It's that running a state like North Korea is kind of hard work. Much better to people not realize they're in a surveillance state and not realize that they're in chains, and to think that they're happy and productive, that they will. Oh, what's that quote from the World Economic Forum? Oh, I will own nothing. I won't own anything or anything, but I'll be happy. Yeah, I think that's the way it's kind of gone, and also I think they've realised that sort of direct state central planning doesn't work, and I think that was one of the reasons for the economic change in the 70s and 80s. And also as well, I think that they probably realised that trade unions were a problem, because trade unions lose their power significantly from the sort of 1980s onwards. Although that is to some extent to do with deindustrialization, which of course you could argue was deliberate in some respects to smash the power of the unions. Because one thing, they were always anti-immigration, which of course is not good for the bottom line of large corporations. So I do think, yes, the societies these days, they do focus on the individual consumer. I think that's because they've realized that that's the way they can make money in this kind with a technological society. Whether that was true historically is another question, but I think with the technological society and mobility, I think they've sort of gravitated to that as the model of the best way of making as much money as possible. And I think that's why that's kind of stayed. And also, Kerry Bolton claims that some of the Americans supported Pol Pot because they thought it was a good way of ending feudalism and getting more technological and sort of advanced society, and then we get Western capital to make some money on the Cambodians. Yeah, I think that's the reason why a broad sense of liberalism exists, is because it's profitable for various classes. I think that's the main reason why it exists. That would be my overall point.
Yep, but still, by being profitable, it's still in a sense capitalist. Now, again, whether the pure capitalists like a Rothbard or Mises would say it's capitalist is a good question. But I think terms, the ambiguity around terms is a central issue here.
Sorry, to just say, I do think they're selling people things. I think it's interesting that the whole Wally thing is like, we're going to sell anti-capitalism to them in a capitalist mode. It's certainly true, and I think they just don't care because they think it'll make them money. And I don't think they think that anything they're doing is fundamentally going to undermine. And if anything, you could argue that harping on all the environmental stuff is a way of increasing control. Anyway, I suppose I maybe go that way. That doesn't mean that the people writing it think that. It just may be the people who are funding them do. I mean, again, there's lots of involvement. Well, and this is slightly different, but the CIA funding Hollywood basically to create pro-war movies, amongst other things. So you could go that way. But yeah, you're buying and selling things as nominal private property titles. But it's not in that sense. So it's clearly not Marxist-Leninist in that sense. But yeah, it's sort of capitalistic. Yeah, I would agree with that.
This is my final comment here. A little bit of a question, a little bit of comment here. Can it be quote with the episode of the question here? Can it be escaped? And I'd say not unless some breakthrough technology comes that changes things. So that's why I brought Nick Land in here, because he was from the left, from my understanding. He's also friends with Mark Fisher, which is an interesting degrees of game separation here. Like, what's the difference between Moldbug and Ben Burgess? It's like one, because like Nick Land knew Mark Fisher. Mark Fisher, has influenced the left a lot from his book Capitalist Realists here. So technology will be the thing that'll break through or not break through here. And if it doesn't break through, if we just sort of just have, maybe slightly updated versions of cell phones, slightly updated versions of computers and things like that, but nothing like a substantial shift. I think liberalism is fairly well secure. It doesn't make everyone happy. Well, it doesn't make the fringes happy. But doesn't see that's the interesting part here. If you spend any time in a like on the outside in a circle reading or watching or listening to their content, you know, none of them are particularly happy. Like like that's the funny thing is like they don't view the social victories as victories. And then when you really press them on like an issue like abortion or so forth, you get these sort of progressive Christians who think that like, well, that's because of the family structure breakdown and economic problems. That people could want, so like even on those issues, it's not entirely clear. Both sides yell at each other a lot, which I mean, I'm not one of these civil people that want everyone to be civil. Like that's not, maybe I don't want war necessarily. I don't know, but it's there's a lot of bluster. There's a lot of pessimism here. Can it be escaped? I'd say it's fairly well secure. And if you take some of Peter Zian's ratings of like China and Russia, those societies are very largely dependent on the U.S. Navy backing free trade. And they say that's an obscure point. Well, if that goes away, then when people like Nick Land talk about like China being some exemplar of the future, they're dependent on the old order, the old, we'll call the ancien regime, and the ancien regime, in my term, equals the current existing Western powers. That world seems like it still has a lot of punch left in it, and it still sort of delivers, good value. It still delivers. It doesn't deliver everyone what they want, but it keeps the things that they truly hate. You brought up a point about censorship here. To be fair, like sometimes when people talk about Twitter and getting banned from Twitter, I think either that's how relevant is that? Now they did go after other services and so forth, but sometimes on these issues of censorship, I can be pushed both ways on this question. Where on the one hand I don't think it's as bad as they say it is. It's sort of understated, as people talk about censorship. Because in a sense, we can still talk about. There's no documents redacted. If it's out there, it's not like it's illegal for you to read them. Although the New Zealand government did make a certain manifesto illegal, I won't mention it. But those things have not happened. And you can always this is where the internet as a technology just wins. I mean, I think this is a lot of the problem with the right-wing Catholic reactions. Like the printing press poses, you could argue, is the thing that drove the Protestant Reformation, not necessarily ideas. To go back to the technology point here, which is my final point, I think under this current technological paradigm, it's fairly strong. And chances are, if there is breakthrough technology, chances are it'll be created in the United States or one of its sort of allies / satellites. And if it's created in one of its allies / satellites, it'll be controlled by the United States or indirectly, and then it'll still have a huge advantage. Which still, liberal, the current order, the ancien regime for the win. It seems fairly secure here. What do you make of my final comments, Swethan? And thanks for doing this. I think this was an interesting episode.
I would agree with technology. I think that's one of the major points. I think if we keep the current level of technology in society, a broad form of liberalism as such, as we describe it so far, is probably likely to exist. Obviously, if there's a collapse, then maybe not. And then, of course, technology could liberate us from sort of the liberal paradigm to some extent. Although I suppose in that sense it would not. I mean, in a sense, you could argue that the existence of the Amish is because liberalism allows them to exist. And they only exist insofar as like a parasite, in a sense. They live off, they free ride. Free ride is probably a better term than parasite. So, yeah, I do think technology is key here. I just now thank everyone for listening. If you enjoyed this podcast, please share it with your friends and family and subscribe to us on Podbean and YouTube. The more subscribers we get, the higher we get in the search rankings, the more people can access this material. And if you'd like to contact the show for any reason, please contact us at mindcrimelibертyshow@gmail.com. That's mindcrimelibертyshow@gmail.com.